I am a human being and I kill human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.
Welcome to Profiler Africa. I'm Paul Llewellyn, and tonight we kick off a brand new series diving deep into the fascinating world of forensic science. Over the next few weeks, we'll explore how forensic experts use cutting-edge science to uncover hidden truths. Tonight, we start with an incredibly interesting aspect of forensic science, essentially the science of identifying human remains. Joining us for the discussion is forensic scientist Lawrence Hill, who we'll be introducing you to in a moment. As always, I am joined by Jared Labuschagne, who from 2001 to 2016 led the investigative psychology section of the South African Police Service. He's now the head of L&S Threat Management, and he is, of course, our profiler. Hello, Jared. How are you doing?
Hi, Paul, and hello to all of you.
Jared, I just wanted to take a little pause here just to tell people about what's coming up over the next couple of weeks. So we've got an incredible interview with Lawrence Hill tonight. And then just give us a little tease of what we can expect for the next couple of weeks, Jared.
Yeah, so it's going to be a kind of a forensic focus. So next week we will have Dr. Shakira Holland. She is a forensic pathologist. She's the head of forensic pathology at the Department of Forensic Medicine at Wits. I've known Shakira for many, many years because I encountered her obviously through my work in the police. It's also the same department where I and Lawrence actually have our appointments. So when you hear my title, professor, it's not actually in the psychology department, it's in the forensic medicine department. And after next week, Shakira will be obviously telling about how she got into forensic medicine and also answering any questions that you've ever wanted to ask a forensic pathologist. So it's going to be like a bit of an open mic also. The week after that, which would be the 4th of February, Dr. Estelle van Staden, who is also a senior forensic pathologist. She's also a published author, and she is also the host of the TV show Autopsy, which is a true crime documentary series. She'll be talking about that and, of course, her career as a forensic pathologist. So that's been more focused on her career and, of course, her book and her TV show. So That's kind of the next 3 weeks, including today.
So we're all going to expand our minds when it comes to forensics and the science, all of the interesting science stuff, and getting up to speed with kind of current trends, etc. Before we dive in, here's how you can support the show. Please subscribe to Profiler Africa. Hit the like button, hit subscribe. Please share the podcast with your friends. This really helps us to grow the podcast and make it something that's sustainable, as it is something that we just do for the love of telling great stories at the moment. Join our Patreon community at patreon.com/Profiler Africa to support the show and unlock exclusive behind-the-scenes content. We're going to be loading up some new stuff on Patreon this week. Send us a super like for a shout out in the next episode. It's a great way to support us directly, so please join the chat tonight and do send us some super likes if you feel like contributing to this endeavor of ours that is Profiler Africa. I think that's the admin done. Now let's jump right on in. Let's introduce our guest first and foremost. We're joined tonight by forensic scientist Lawrence Hill. He's a lecturer at the University of the Witwatersrand's Department of Forensic Medicine. I'm just gonna go through the. Hi, Lawrence. How are you doing? Let's say good evening first. I'm great, thanks. I'm going to go through Lawrence's credentials here because I think this sets the scene nicely for the discussion. And then, Jared, I'll hand over you to dive in with the convo. So Lawrence has a Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Science with honors in Zoology and Ecology, a Master of Science in Medicine, and a Certificate in Statistics for Research and Design, all from the University of the Witwatersrand. He also holds a postgraduate diploma in Business Administration, a Master of Business Administration, and a Postmaster's qualification in Leadership Coaching. Lawrence worked as a technician at the Division of Forensic Medicine in pathology from 2012 to 2025. He's published several articles in the areas of forensic science. His main research interests lie in estimating the time of death to improve the accuracy of time of death estimates and in the use of isotopes for human identification. Furthermore, Lawrence has supervised numerous students at both honors and master's levels in the areas of forensic taphonomy, forensic entomology, and forensic phycology. Okay, I mean, some of these I'm not even certain of I'm getting the pronunciation right. So you guys, I've got so much to learn tonight. He has consulted the Forensic Pathology Service and South African Police Service on several medico-legal cases and testified in court as an expert witness. He currently registered for his PhD through the School of Anatomical Science, aiming to use stable isotopes to aid in estimating human provenance to assist in the identification of human remains. Sure, a true forensic scientist. I think that's what that says, Gerard. Let me hand over to you.
Thanks. Yes, so welcome, Lawrence. And obviously you can explain some of those terms, because even some of them I'm not sure if I understand what they are. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It's always interesting because when I started studying psychology, and even really when I qualified as a psychologist, I never thought I was going to ever end up doing what I ended up doing in the police and what I've been doing since then. Had you always known when you went to go and study that you wanted to end up doing forensic work?
So I definitely had a keen interest in forensics from when I was in school. I think probably when I was in primary school was probably the first time I picked up a book on forensic science, and I was looking specifically at serial murderers in that case. And gradually, as I started learning a little bit more, I started to look at different areas. At one point, I had an interest in forensic pathology and even forensic anthropology. And then gradually, as I was looking at different study options, it kind of shifted and changed, because I realized that my interest was more in the biological sciences. And I had a keen interest in animals and plants and the environment. So I actually started doing my zoology and ecology degree because of this interest in animals and plants. And as I started to learn a little bit more, I started to realize, well, even doing animals and plants, it doesn't exclude you from being able to do forensics, because animals are always found in any environment, and especially insects are found on human remains. So this means that when we look at an insect, we can start to find out a little bit more about what has happened in that environment, and we can see how they're associated with the human body. And that's what shifted me to have a bit of an interest in forensic entomology. And then after I finished my undergraduate degrees, I started looking around for different work opportunities, and I happened to come across the Johannesburg mortuary, and I contacted someone there. And as a result of that, I was able to gradually start, developing myself, in the forensic field. Even though my initial background was purely zoology and ecology, it wasn't even in forensic science. And from there, only my postgraduate qualifications have been in forensic science itself.
And I mean, a lot of these things that we've, in terms of forensic sciences, 20 years ago didn't even exist in South Africa. I mean, they existed as sciences in other parts of the world, but, people kind of just got roped into it and started doing it and asked to assist on a case, and kind of in a way became the local pioneers. And I mean, forensic entomology is one of those ones. The first time I know that it was ever used was Dr. Mansell, who was asked by Vivian Bealt, one of our forensic sciences guy, to come and assist with the Moses Satoli cases in Johannesburg and Pretoria. And, Mansell, who never thought of himself as a forensic entomologist, but he was a specialist in flies, was actually kind of became the groundbreaker in South Africa for forensic entomology. And we referred to it in some of our webinars we've had, like the quarry case. We spoke about, how entomology was very accurately used to predict the post-mortem interval. But a lot of people might not know exactly what it is and sort of how do you go about it. Can you just give like the overview of what really is forensic entomology?
Sure. So forensic entomology looks specifically at insects. So it looks at how insects fit into the medico-legal framework. So initially, one of the things you have to look at with any insect in any environment is how the environment affects that insect. So even within forensic entomology, doesn't necessarily mean you're only going to focus on insects. Some forensic entomologists will also work on other arthropods. So this means if you're looking at spiders or even scorpions that might be present, it depends on what their biology tells you. So very often people who come into forensic entomology have an ecology and zoology background, which allows them to understand how does the environment itself affect the insects and everything surrounding the body. Because one of the challenges, especially when you want a postmortem interval, is that you often don't know what has happened. So when a person is killed and their body's found in an open felt, for example, what do we do? How do we actually break down the case? So typically what happens is that when you get to the scene, you have to look at what the environment is. So let's say it's an open vault, and you see it's a large open area. There might be no trees, it might just be grass, and there might be some small shrubs in the area as well. From there, you have to start breaking down, well, what insects would be associated in this area? And you would start having a look at what insects were found on the body itself and what insects were possibly found under the soil, and you look around the environment as well. So you start having to break down that environmental aspect. Then you also have to go a step further and see, well, what insects are on the body itself? And based on these insects, look at their biology and their overall ecology as well, because different insects are going to impact the body in different ways. So for example, we refer to necrophagous insects, and these are insects that are going to be feeding on the body itself. Now, this means that they're going to be gradually degrading the body. They are going to arrive because the body is their food source. Now, these are the ones we mainly use for our estimation of a postmortem interval, which is also known as a time of death estimation, although more accurately, it's a time since colonization, because we would look at the insects and we would look at how quickly do they arrive on the body, and then how quickly do they develop on the body based on various different variables. And one of the variables we look at is temperature. So most of the forensically important insects that we deal with have temperature-dependent development. So this means that in higher temperatures, they develop faster, and in lower temperatures, they develop a little bit slower. And this allows us to be able to use essentially a regression analysis to be able to see how quickly they are developing. So we would look at the total growth rate of that insect at different temperatures. So I actually provided some pictures. So if you want to throw up the slideshow now, that'll actually be a good place to kind of walk you through a little bit about how this works. So to go through the entomology side before we go into everything else. So this is the basic setup of what we would have inside one of our labs. So this is the equipment that we required for the rearing of the insects. So at the top there, you can see these are the adult breeding cages. So when we go to a scene and we collect insects from a scene, we want to get a time of death estimation. We would normally collect whatever's present on the body. So this will be your larvae, or sometimes even the puparia, so like the little cocoon that's present on the body. And we would actually collect these and we would store them until we get to an adult stage. And the adults would go into these cages that you see right on the top. This allows us to, put the males and females together. They then mate, and from there we can then look at their growth and development. So if you go to the next picture, this image here is one of the cages, or one of the containers which we would put our larvae into. So you can see that we've placed some sawdust at the bottom. So the reason for this is because when you place your maggots into an environment, once you've collected them off the body, very often they're going to need to feed on something, but they're also going to need to pupate at some stage, because as they go through their development, they go through a larval stage. They then move into a pupal stage, which is where they form like a cocoon. If you go to the next image, what we do is we provide them with a food source, which we're going to place inside these containers here. So these containers here allow us to be able to have that in a separate area away from the actual substrate at the bottom. So if you go to the next image, you'll see that in this one, what we've done is we've actually added in some chicken livers. So you can use chicken liver. Some people use pork liver as well. Now, this does have an effect on development, so you have to be very careful which one you use because of the nutrients present in it. But it allows us to be able to place our larvae in there. They can then feed quite happily. And you can see that there's a mesh lid placed on top. This stops them from escaping. This allows us to be able to look at how they develop over a period of time at whatever temperature we are rearing them inside our lab. Then we can see how quickly they develop at various different temperatures. So for example, we will look at development at 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 25 degrees, and we'll look at how they develop at those different temperatures. So this allows us to see, well, what is their temperature-dependent development? Once we have this value, we're able to use this to work backwards over time based on the temperatures at a crime scene to work out roughly at what time those insects were laid on the body based on the fly's arrival and colonization of that body. Sometimes there is a larger period of time, so there'll be a larger range, and that does depend on the types of cases, but we'll talk you through some cases in the next little bit. If we go to the next image, here I've added another element which I haven't yet mentioned, and this is humidity. Now, insects like typically a very humid environment, so roughly 70% humidity, So when we want a nice stable environment for them to develop, we want to be able to provide them with this humidity. And that's why here we've gone for a simple, cheap option. And this allows us to be able to literally have a container where they are able to develop quite quickly and easily because they have a nice stable environment which has got a fair amount of humidity. Of course, if we have a full incubator where we're able to allow them to have stable temperature and humidity, that's the first option we would always go for. But in low-cost environments, sometimes like where you don't have fancy incubators, this worked as well. So when I initially started, this is exactly what we were doing. We were placing wet paper towel on top of the containers to try and maintain humidity, which we would then spray down twice a day just to try and keep that humidity quite stable. And we found it did seem to vary a little bit. So it would vary from around about 60 to 80% humidity, which is fantastic for our development anyway, because we don't have any major problems with the development of these maggots. So if we go to the next image, or the next set of images, rather, we're looking at some cases here. So this is a case where if you're looking at this body, you can see that there are hundreds to thousands of maggots on the body. So this is one of the challenges. When we get to a body and we find a body at a death scene, sometimes you don't know what you're going to get. And there can be maggots all over. So maggots can form what is referred to as maggot masses. And when you have a huge number of maggots together like this, remember I mentioned that temperature is very important and we want to look at temperature and how maggots develop at different temperatures. Well, when we have a huge number of maggots like this, they can actually maintain that temperature quite well without regard for the external environment. So even if it's quite cool, they can still maintain a very high temperature. So when we're looking at some of the bodies, we've actually seen some interesting, weird circumstances where when a body is removed from a fridge, the fridge is sitting at like 2 degrees. As you remove the body out of that fridge and it's coming into a slightly warmer environment, you can actually see the maggots moving, and you can sometimes even see steam coming off of that body because of the fact that the insects are even warmer than the external environment. And this is even while they were inside a refrigerator. So they're still active because the temperature of the maggots can sometimes be as high as 16, 17 degrees, even inside a refrigerator where they've been for a couple of days. So this shows that they are able to maintain their temperature really well, and this can have an effect on our time of death estimation. So this is one of the big problems that we have to deal with, is that when an insect goes into a fridge, after it's removed from the refrigerator, we can end up with skewing of our postmortem interval. So that's one of the big challenges that we can have, in a lot of circumstances. So it's typically why we want to go to a death scene and we want to collect insects and work on those insects before they actually go into the refrigerators at the mortuaries. So that's one of the problems. Now, if we go to the next set of images, so this is what it would look like on burnt remains. So you can see the remains are now burnt, they dried, they desiccated. Now, very often this would prevent insects from colonizing for a while because the body has burnt and it's actually charred. But what you might notice there, you can see that there are little cracks in the skin. So what happens is as the body is charring, the skin can actually break and tear open, and flies will still come to the body because underneath the charred tissue, just like when you're having a braai, if you overcook your meat, everything in the middle can sometimes still be raw if your fire is way too hot. So if you're sticking a very large roast on the fire, you'll find that what happens is you can char the outside, but the inside can still be nice and juicy. And that's exactly what happens here. The maggots find a way to get onto the body and into the body to be able to still feed and to be able to eventually pupate. So if we go to the next image, here you can see that there are some pupa. So this is what a little puparium would look like. So what happens is as the maggots are developing, they will move through various instar stages, and this is just stages of the different larval development. And once they have gone through all of that and they are ready to start developing and becoming a fully developed adult, they'll pupate or go into almost like a cocoon stage. And from there, they will then emerge and become, the adult fly. And this is where our flies come from. So I know I've had people ask me, are flies, just where do they come from? How did they happen? Maggots as well. Some people thought that maggots just burst out from the body, kind of like a, weird thing. As soon as you're dead, suddenly there's maggots inside you already and they start bursting out. Well, no, flies arrive at the body and they lay eggs. and that's where we get the maggots from. That's why you'll find the pupa that'll be around. Now, these pupa are often also mistaken for rat feces. So you mentioned Professor Mansell. I remember in one of his lectures that he gave, he said, one of the ways that you can always tell whether it's a pupa or whether it's rat droppings is you stick it in your mouth and you swirl it around a little bit. If it dissolves, it's rat droppings. If it doesn't, then it's a puparium.
Yeah, so actually, don't do that, obviously.
No, don't do that. I wouldn't suggest sticking anything in your mouth from a crime scene, but this is one of the suggestions which was made, and it gets the point home. I mean, if you have a little container with water, drop it in. If it dissolves, then it's rat droppings. If it doesn't, it's puparium. And even when we collect them, we drop them into alcohol anyway for preservation.
So in a nutshell, so what you're trying to do is you get to the crime scene, obviously, because you said you don't want to do this from the fridge once they've been refrigerated, because that slows down the development phase because it's cold. You get to the crime scene, you take samples of what's there, and if you know what insect that is, you know its typical life cycle. So if it's this big, if it's a maggot, if it's this big, or if it's the pupa, if it's this, and that roughly would mean that this body has been infested for 2 days or 1 day. In a nutshell, I mean, there's obviously much more complicated calculations that you're doing there. And that kind of is how you work out that time period that you think the body was there. But as you say, it's got to do with how long the body's been exposed. So, I mean, if you had a body that's wrapped tightly in a plastic bag, and maybe it's been there for a week, and then maybe some dogs come and scavenge and tear the bag, then obviously your insects are only going to be infesting the body much later. Or if the body was kept in a fridge, and then of course, so it's not, as you say, it's not the necessarily time of death, it's really how long that body's been exposed. And I know we always think about post-mortem interval, in other words, the time that the body has been sort of dead, in other words. Is the main way that people use forensic entomology. But I mean, I've also seen some other interesting way. I think of the Lee Matthews case with Donovan Woodley, obviously kidnapped and murdered her. I mean, there I think the doctor, they found a certain type of spider, a funnel spider, and they called in an expert in funnel spiders who says, well, these spiders would not make the little funnel nest in direct sunlight. So either this body was therefore not there during the day, it must have been left at night. So I mean, there's other ways you can use entomology. Another one I once heard of where they just said, look, this insect isn't from this area. So this body, this insect, for argument's sake, is only found in Tabazimbi, or for example, and that can also tell you about the movement. Are there other kind of ways that it can be used that I haven't touched on so far?
So yes, so it is very much case dependent. So like you mentioned, like very often, there'll be insects that can be found on a body, but they may not necessarily be associated with the crime scene, and it can tell you a lot about what's happened. So, for example, what some people do is they've heard about forensic entomology, so they think, I'm going to be clever and I'm going to kind of skew what you're going to see. So one of the cases which actually happened in the UK, the gentleman decided, well, I want to try and make it difficult. I know forensic entomology works, so he went to a pet shop and he procured some insects from the pet shop and went and dumped them onto the body. Because his idea was, if I have these larger looking insects on, it's going to obscure everything. They're going to think it's something different. The problem was that just by doing that, all they had to do was look at all the little pet stores and see, well, who purchased from these pet stores and who purchased a large number of these insects. And they were able to track it back, and he unfortunately used his credit card, which meant that he got caught very quickly as a result. And if it wasn't for that, it would have taken them longer to catch him. But it was just because, these insects don't naturally occur here, and you've just found insects that are not from this area. So one of the really good examples is if you're looking at the book The Silence of the Lambs, there's a very good example in the book itself. So the movie doesn't really go into it very well, but the book does far more justice to how forensic entomology can be used when you're looking at the presence of, for example, a moth, as it is in the book. And there's multiple factors that go into it, like looking at where do these insects naturally occur. And sometimes if they have a very specific diet and they're found outside of that area, it shows there's something very wrong. They shouldn't be in this area, and it tells you something else has happened. So other cases that have happened where people have been transporting a body or they've driven across an area, their alibi was, I was at a conference. But in actual fact, when you look at the rental vehicle, you can see that the rental vehicle that they had been used. So this is another case which happened in the United States. The guy used the rental vehicle and he drove from one state to another to murder his wife. And what happened is that when that car had been taken back to the rental, the car rental place, they ended up doing some repairs, and they happened to say, well, we had actually put in a new radiator just before this guy had used it. So they were able to look at when the radiator was placed, and based on that radiator, they actually collected the insects off, and they were able to track the movement of the vehicle based off of the insects and where the guy had been. And they realized this guy had definitely driven this vehicle across the state lines to where his wife was, murdered his wife, driven back in the middle of the night, and then pretended like he'd always been at this conference. Yeah. Which, was something extremely useful for showing how insects can be used not just for time of death. There's multiple ways that they can be used, and it very much depends on the case, of course. Like you mentioned, using spiders as well. Spiders can tell you a lot about what's happening at the scene, just like the presence of other predators as well. It depends on why they're there and what has happened. But even some cases, the exclusion of an insect tells you a lot. So I know that I was also asked to consult with the Palesa Madiba case. So with Palesa Madiba, she was that UJ student who was abducted and went missing, and no one knew what had happened. And she was eventually found buried in this friend of hers back garden. And it was actually her friend's uncle that had killed her. And in that case, I was asked to have a look at some of the insects that were present in the environment. Now, the problem was there weren't any. So straight away, that shows if there's no insects, it means that the body was immediately covered or enclosed in an environment which prevented the colonization of insects. So just that, it tells us that typically that body was concealed quite rapidly. And just that exclusion of insects tells us a lot about what happened at the scene. And then, of course, there was multiple other pieces of evidence that were used as well in that case, just to describe exactly what had happened. But very often, you have to break down multiple aspects and not just look at just the insects. You have to consider everything else that actually plays a role in the case as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I know, as I said, I mentioned Mervyn Mansell was kind of the first guy called in to assist, I think, as I said, Inspector Vivian Bealt, who called him in from forensics. And that kind of kicked it off. And then people like Sergeant Andre Massane were sort of doing the collection part, and then we'll be passing it on to Dr. Mansell, etc. But there's not a lot of people in this country that are doing this from a forensic point of view. I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of a bit out of the business now, but I mean, I would guess is that even 5 people in the country doing forensic entomology, that's probably a lot. Is that correct, or has it grown?
So it definitely has grown. So there are several people at various universities that are involved in forensic entomology. But a lot of the people that are involved in forensic entomology are going to be in academia. So will be employed by the universities itself, rather than, being at the mortuaries or even, with the police. So the police have forensic entomologists, and the police crime scene technicians are also trained in the collection of forensic data from insects specifically. So they will collect the insects, and that will be sent through, and that will be analyzed by the police themselves. And then they will provide a time of death estimation. The problem is that, you very often don't know, and, it does depend on someone at the scene identifying what insects are present. But sometimes you don't realize there are insects there. So what happens is also when you go to the autopsy itself, you find that when you get to look at the body, you'll find that often what happens is that you'll find insects around, the eyes, they'll be in the nose, and they'll often go for the mouth. These are the natural orifices, and this is where the odors of decay start actually exuding from the body. Now, sometimes what happens is, especially when the mouth is open, you'll find the flies will crawl into the mouth and they'll lay the eggs inside the mouth. So the maggots can start developing and they can start feeding inside the mouth. The only way you're going to know they are there is to actually open the mouth properly and have a look. So even at the death scene, people are often not aware of this evidence, and it's only realized much later on at the time of the autopsy. And this is after the body has been refrigerated. And that can cause changes in development, because insects can also enter it's almost a survival state, which is known as a diapause, which is where they change their development. They can even pause their growth and development because of the fact that there's an external stress. And this external stress from the environment, which is a cold room, places that stress on their bodies. So they change their development. They slow down their metabolism. Now, when they're taken out of the refrigerator, it means you don't know how much development occurred or if there was absolutely no development. And this is why it can actually skew our estimation of our time since death. So that's why very often we want to try to get to the body before, but that's not always possible, unfortunately. So that's why you have to consider multiple factors and try to work around them as well. And, if you can, have fridge temperatures. So I try to keep a record of whatever the fridge temperatures are by placing little thermal data loggers inside the refrigerator, so I know what is happening in the refrigerator. It's not the perfect situation because you'd want it with the body itself, but it's the next best alternative.
And I mean, even if you are an entomologist, a professor, doing it forensically, like you say, is very different. You have to prove those little things like, did you measure the temperature of the fridge, or did you measure this all the time? So it's other factors that you'd have to take into account that if you weren't exposed to the forensic setting or the chain of evidence issues, you could definitely get yourself into a lot of trouble. So another thing that you mentioned, which I don't think a lot of people realize, is that bodies in South Africa, when they're found today, they will be autopsied the next day, unless there's a religious reason. I think Muslim people and I think Jewish people who have to be buried before sundown, they will make a lot of effort to try and autopsy the body that same day so that the body can be released. But the law trumps religion if that's not possible. So we're not autopsying immediately. So as you say, the body's going to be probably refrigerated, and if you then do the samples, as you say, that will skew the development of that. I want to make sure we've got enough time to talk about your other things that you've done, because I think the next topic is going to be something we could speak about for hours. Anything else you kind of want to maybe think that the viewers might want to hear about forensic enter before we shift over?
If cut the basics.
If I may, I wanted to jump in with a question, guys, if I could. I just wanted to kind of bring this home to kind of the context, to the reality of working on these types of cases in South Africa. Following on from your question, Jared, where you asked, how many forensic entomologists are there in the country? I mean, how often would the full contingent of kind of necessary scientists actually go out to a crime scene? What is the reality in South Africa when it comes to the kind of the application of what you do?
So it's very dependent on the case, especially when there's cases where there's a question of time of death. That's normally when people are going to, ask for an expert to come in and provide assistance. But normally, this kind of expertise is going to have to be either requested by the South African police or it's going to be requested by the Forensic Pathology Service. So that's why very often, a lot of the individuals who are involved in doing research in forensic entomology, who are experts, are going to be at the universities. So very often they won't be consulted straight away. They'll only be consulted a little bit later on down the line. So this means that sometimes evidence, it can either, be degraded over time, and this does happen, but very often we're still able to provide a fairly good estimate based on what is present on the body. Yeah. So even when we do our time of death estimation, very often you would look at development on the body based on the insect's development itself. But we can also use other methodologies as well. So for example, there's what's referred to as a succession model. So when you look at different insects on the body at a specific period in time, it allows you to work out what has happened on that body, and based on the different environments and also based on the different insects that are there, very often you can get a very broad timeline. And this is why very often we refer to a maximum postmortem interval and a minimum postmortem interval. So we actually work with both, and we normally give a very good range. So it's not, like you see on TV, they say, the guy's been dead 18 days. I would never give an estimate like that because you don't know. You don't know how long it took for an insect to arrive on the body. And that's why a lot of our experts are always going to give a range. But unfortunately, we're not as actively involved in a lot of cases as what we would probably like. And this is why I think a lot of people that are involved in forensic entomology, or even do their masters and doctorates in forensic entomology, end up working in other fields as well. And it's sometimes, in agricultural areas, sometimes in, human identification. Like this is kind of where I've started to transition into and move more away from forensic entomology and more into another area where I find that I can actually use my skills on almost a daily basis.
I'd also say that probably the key factor as to whether or not it's going to be used is the detective. Yes. Do you have an experienced detective? Do they know about this? And then, of course, at least if you can get the crime scene guys of SAPS to at least, at a very minimum, take those little containers with alcohol, chuck as many insects inside, freezing them, so to speak, at that point of development. I mean, even if they can do that, I think you'd probably say, well, this is the pupa or the larva of this fly, therefore this thing has probably been exposed for a rough period of time. So I think the detective is the key aspect. And then, of course, having the people who know how to at least collect the evidence. And then, like you say, getting it off to the forensic entomology. So in the old days, you used to find the guys at their serious and violent crime units that were quite experienced in lots of complex cases and probably would be exposed from training courses. I know on our course, we used to present the serial murder course. We typically would have forensic entomologists come and speak, forensic pathologists, a whole bunch of different experts, so that the people would be aware of what can be done, what is needed to allow that to happen, and who to contact. Yeah, in a nutshell.
Okay, great.
Yeah, should we move on to the the second part, which is the human identification. So as you say, your career kind of morphed into more the field of identifying humans. Tell us about it. How does that work?
Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of a background about how it actually started to transition into this area. So while I was still busy with my master's in forensic entomology, I started to also assist with other research. So there was a research project which was looking at stable isotopes. And they were specifically looking at the isotopes that were present in local individuals and foreigners, just to try to see, well, what are the differences that we're seeing in these isotopes? Now, the isotope we were looking at specifically was strontium. Now, strontium isotopes are derived naturally from bedrock in a local geographical area. So gradually what happens is that is broken down, and what you find is that, that is taken up by plants in an area because, they're growing in that area, they're growing through the soils, and as the soils are gradually degraded and they're actually absorbed by the plant's taking some of the strontium. This also happens from water. So groundwater and rivers that are in an area will also gradually weather the rock, and they will also take up that strontium. Now, what happens is that from our natural diets, we're eating food, we're eating plants, we're eating animals, the strontium moves all the way through that food web, and eventually it comes back into us based on the fact that we're busy eating whatever food source it is or drinking that water. And when we look at our teeth develop at very specific times in our lifetime. So we can actually look at the specific age and look at when different teeth develop and when they fully erupt and where we have our first permanent set of teeth. So the teeth we looked at was the first molar. And this is fully developed at around about 5.5 years old, but starts developing and the enamel starts to form at around about 6 months roughly. And this means that we're able to see almost a snapshot in time. What has happened in an individual from 6 months all the way through until about 6 years roughly. So the nice thing with that is it allows us to see, well, what has happened to an individual, based on essentially their diet. Now, in some areas in the world, we found that the data has actually showed that it can be very closely matched to a specific geographical region. Now, this becomes extremely beneficial because it shows us what has happened during those childhood times from 6 months to 6 years. And this is often the country of residence of an individual. So this will allow us to be able to work out, well, where was a person while they were alive or, while they were a child at that point in time. So when we look at it from a human identification perspective, we're able to say, well, when we look at the dental enamel of our first molar of individuals from South Africa, and we compare it to individuals from outside of South Africa, we actually find that there's very marked differences in those strontium profiles. So the strontium values that we get are very different. And this allows us to be able to say, well, we can see if we have an individual in South Africa and we can see that their strontium values are completely different from locals, it shows that this person occurred from outside of this region most likely. And then we're able to say, well, now we know this person is not a local individual, which means we can then go to Interpol, or we can even go to other foreign governments and say, this is what we've got. We've got a body, we've taken fingerprints, we've taken DNA, we just don't have a match. And that's the big problem. So everyone thinks that DNA is fantastic, that DNA can give you the identity of anyone and everyone. DNA is only useful when you have a reference sample to be able to compare with. So if you don't have a sample to compare with, unfortunately, you don't get the identification. And this is why we need to find, well, where can we find an individual who can provide a reference sample? It can be from that individual from when they were alive, or it can be from a close relative, a blood relative specifically, to be able to help us identify, based on DNA. But we still need to know, where do we look? How do we find them? So I started working on a project during my master's doing exactly this. And that was kind of how I got started into human identification. And then gradually, as we started to expand, I also started to do additional courses on human identification, and we started to work with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and they actually conducted some of these training programs. So they started to do it for medical legal experts in Africa, and I attended one of their training programs at the University of Pretoria. And based on this, I was able to then learn a lot more about what is required in human identification. And what we started to do is we actually set up the first human ID unit in South Africa. And it was myself and a number of other colleagues, from Holland and from South Africa as well. We all sat down together. We actually developed exactly what was required to be able to set up an ID unit. And we started to develop the local ID unit in South Africa. And this ID unit, I think it's still currently the only one that's fully active in the country. But I know that that Pretoria has also started to develop their own one. And I know that the University of Cape Town, I think, is also busy developing one as well. And the advantage of this is it means that what we've done, we've also trained people from all over, and it's helped people learn about what is required for identifying human remains, especially when they become extremely decomposed. So if you look at some of the images that I showed earlier, I mean, when you have maggots on a body, very often the body is badly decomposed. And this is something that I noticed while I was doing my forensic entomology, that a lot of the bodies that we work with are so badly degraded and decomposed that the facial features are completely distorted. You can't identify them by looking at them. And unfortunately, fingerprints are fantastic because they really help us identify someone in South Africa. But if they're not South African, where do we look to be able to identify them? Because very often, if they're not in our criminal database, we don't have a sample to be able to look at and to be able to provide an ID, but then they have to be, in the criminal records. If they're a foreigner, very often we don't have their fingerprints available. And then we have to look outside of the country for a reference. But the problem is, again, insects eat everything. And this includes the flesh that's around the fingers as well. And fingers can also become, badly degraded, almost mummified as well. And because of that, we don't get fingerprints. And then we have to rely purely on DNA. And then it depends on whether there's a sample available. And those are some of the big challenges that we started to notice. And that was why my interest started to shift and say, well, what can we do based on all of that to still provide an identification and based on what I was already working on? And that led me to what I'm currently doing, which is my doctorate, which is looking specifically at stable isotopes, but it's looking at local individuals that live in Gauteng to see, well, what is the strontium values present in their teeth? And then we're going and looking at unidentified skeletal remains and seeing, well, where do these individuals come from? If they're found within the range of values that I have for local individuals, it shows that these are most likely locals. We just don't yet have a reference sample. But if they fall outside of that range, they're possibly from other areas of South Africa, or they could even be foreigners. And then it still allows us to be able to say, well, now we know where to start looking. We know to look outside of this region. We now need to contact other people from other provinces or other countries to try to help us identify these individuals. And South Africa's got a very large migrant population that moves in and out of South Africa. And that's one of the challenges that we have with identification, is that we don't always know, because some of these individuals are documented, but large number are not. So from an identification perspective, this poses a huge number of challenges, because if you're not registered in the country, we won't have a record that you were here. We won't have your fingerprints. We won't have any information about you at all.
So, and I mean, it's not just, as you say, it's not just about, a decomposed body. I mean, this could also be in situations like mass like a plane crash
Exactly.
or a train crash. I think there's other examples of cases. And also just want to comment that, what's interesting about the forensic medicine department, at WIT specifically, I don't know if it's so much other forensic medicine departments, is it's more like really become a forensic sciences department. Because, I mean, you're there, you're not a forensic pathologist. I'm there, I'm not a forensic pathologist. So they try to sort of rebrand it as a forensic sciences department. And that's really great. And I don't know any other forensic pathology departments that have kind of gone that route to that extent. Unless I'm mistaken, you might know better, in South Africa at least. So it's quite, a very unique department in that sense, that you have all these multiple disciplines and providing these services, at least at the Johannesburg Forensic Pathology Services Mortuary in Braamfontein, that these kind of are all available to SAPs. SAPs can make use of these services, and it doesn't cost them anything. But again, it comes back to do they know of what can be done, what's available, etc. But as I said earlier, the types of examples of situations when you need to identify bodies, have you ever had experience with these sort of more mass disaster kind of situations?
So we have, I mean, we had those recent fires which happened in central Joburg, and there was a large number of dead bodies that we had to help with. So a number of my colleagues actually went through to the scene to be able to assist them, with actually collecting all of the remains. And once those remains were then collected, to then make sure that all the evidence was correctly collected from every single one of those bodies. So we have a structure that we use, which is actually based off of Interpol's disaster victim identification form, which is also referred to as the PINK form. So it's an international standard that's used. So that's the same kind of standard that we follow. We've just adapted it for our situation. So we use those forms to be able to collect as much information from every individual as possible, just to make sure that we've got, every possible little piece of evidence before, that body has to be eventually buried or before it goes back to the family. Because sometimes what happens is that, pieces of evidence are missed and bodies can get mixed up, which is what we really don't ever want to have happen. I mean, that's one of the worst things when the body's released to the wrong family. So we make sure we collect absolutely everything from every single individual. This includes looking at various different features. So we look at, we start at, basically the head. So we look at what is the eye color. We look at what is the presence of hair. Is it short hair? Do you have a beard present on your face? We look at the dentition. So we look at the teeth. We open the mouth. We photograph the teeth. We look at what teeth are present. If there's anything that's very noticeable in the teeth. We look for the presence of scars. We look for the presence of tattoos. We then go through the whole body, look for any tattoos present anywhere on the body, any scars that might be present. We even take the body and we actually x-ray the body to look for any signs of previous injuries. Because if we have previous injuries, this is what would be something that happened while the individual was alive. This is referred to as antemortem data. It means that we can use previous records of while that person was alive, and we can compare it to what we have on the body, which is our post-mortem data. And by comparing this antemortem and post-mortem data, it can help us provide possible linkages of who this person might be. So if you have a relative who, broke their right arm at whatever age, and they happen to have this very specific tattoo present on their body in a specific area, and they happen to look a certain way, and they were found at the scene, you can give that information to the South African police, and they would then use all of that to match with what we've collected from the body itself. By providing those linkages, then we can say, well, this is most likely, this individual. Then we do DNA, and we would collect a DNA sample, and they would collect a DNA sample from the blood relative, and the South African Police Service would provide that DNA analysis. And then once there's a match that's made, then we can say this is definitely the identification of that individual, and then they can be released to that family member. But it requires very meticulous collection of evidence from every single body that you're dealing with. And that's why we use these kinds of international standards to make sure we collect absolutely everything that we can from those individuals.
I mean, I've even heard stories of them, x-raying the body and then seeing the person has a pacemaker, and each of those has like a serial number that you can trace, or if you had a hip replacement, you got this titanium thing stuck. They often have serial numbers that those have even been used to eventually trace an ID. But as you point out, it's ultimately, you guys can gather all this stuff, but it's actually the police's responsibility to take it and then ID someone. I mean, it's not your job to run around trying to contact Home Affairs, and am I correct? It still kind of ultimately remains the job of the police to take that info and do something with it. Now, SAPS also has the Victim Identification Center, which was started by Brigadier Leonie Ross, 15 years ago or more, and I think Brigadier A. Rousseau just recently took over.
Yes.
How do they fit into this kind of process, and what do they do that you guys can't do, and how do you guys work with each other?
So we actually work very closely together. So very often, they will be involved in cases where, they need to collect as much evidence as possible, at a crime scene, for example. They will assist with that evidence collection, but we also provide assistance because, very often if you look at the sheer number of cases that we have in South Africa, unfortunately, they can't get to every single individual, case to be able to provide, full analysis. So what we do is we provide the full analysis. We collect all of that data. they're also able to do that. But it's when they're actually, requested to be there to be able to collect all that evidence. And that also depends on the investigating officers that are dealing with those cases. So like you mentioned before, when you have an investigating officer that's willing to drive it and do a lot more, then things can be driven very well and they can change a lot. But when you have someone who doesn't put in that same level of effort, unfortunately, it means that sometimes, the identification can kind of get pushed to the wayside a little bit. And when it's an anonymous individual, they're found in strange circumstances, they're found lying under a bridge, they're assumed to be homeless. Unfortunately, the level of investigation that goes into it isn't as high. It's a disappointing fact that, it's not viewed as being a high profile case. So the level of effort, which should be the same for every individual, it isn't always the same. And that's a reality that we have in South Africa. Very often when the media starts to actually broadcast, these are, the problems that we're having, people put a lot more effort into those areas. But, when someone is, almost a faceless individual, as a lot of our homeless individuals are almost seen as, it's a very disappointing thing because these people could still be identified. And you'd want them to be identified because they may have family or loved ones who would like to actually bury their remains, but it doesn't happen because people aren't putting the same level of effort into it. So that's how we still try to provide, it doesn't matter who the individual is, we provide the same level of data collection and we still collect DNA. And, you mentioned that, in terms of the number of cases that we deal with, that sometimes we don't really know what's happening. And the thing is that we really don't know what's happening with a large number of our cases. With the case that we do collect, we collect evidence from every single individual that hasn't been identified that gets referred to us by the Forensic Pathology Service. So then what happens is that we will go and we'll collect evidence from those cases. And very often we know about, of a handful of them that eventually get identified. Most of them are identified via fingerprints, but sometimes it's via DNA. But I think there's been like 1 or 2 cases from DNA. And, it shows that we've gone through the effort, but it doesn't always lead to an identification, which is a little bit disappointing. But the thing is that we've collected the sample. So if someone comes forward 10 years from now, that person can still find their loved one as well. Now, the Victim Identification Unit as well, they also provide that assistance. So we send our samples through to them as well. They also provide assistance with things that we don't do. So, for example, facial reconstruction, we don't deal with facial reconstruction. We will clean the skeletal remains at the Johannesburg Forensic Pathology Service, but the police will then take the skull, for example, and they will do the facial reconstruction because we don't do that ourselves. So very often, the police, they're not going to want to clean the remains because they don't have the facilities for doing that. So we will do that. It's the same thing as our trauma analysis or our forensic anthropology. That is done at Wits University by the School of Anatomical Sciences. So Professor Desiree Brits does a lot of that analysis. So she will provide the full anthropological analysis of the skeletal remains. And, from that, provide a biological profile, which can possibly also assist with identification. And, the police don't do that. So they rely on Wits University and, the people in the School of Anatomical Sciences to provide that analysis for the police as well. So a lot of what we do, the police don't do. What the police do, we don't do ourselves.
I think for those of us that have watched that Anisha van Niekerk case we had with Jan de Lange, I mean, there, for example, I think it was Marina Steen. I think she was still in Pretoria back then. And she did that sort of analysis of the skull and the injuries, etc., and stuff like that. So, yeah, Paul.
Is it fair to say that, comes up on the podcast quite often, we're at the forefront, we have the most modern technologies to apply, and we have some of the most kind of forward-thinking scientists in the field, but the problem lies at the management and application to be able to apply, to expand that so that it can really be of use so it's not just hand-picked cases that are getting this type of treatment. I just wanted to bring up a comment from just in relation to that from one of our regular listeners, Marius. Sorry, let me just make that a bit bigger. Sorry, guys. Sorry. This is okay. Here we go. Entomology is underutilized in SAP's investigation. Not all detectives are aware of the value proper awareness is required to promote entomology? And I know we're talking outside of just onto entomology as well, but there's just a comment from Marius. And then a question from Pierre. In the USA, they have death farms to study this. What is your opinion of what is your option of this kind of research, or what is your opinion on this kind of research?
But that research is actually phenomenal. I mean, it's exactly what we need to be able to do in South Africa as well. Currently we don't have a true body farm. So we use pigs as an analog for humans, which it's the best alternative that we currently have available until we're able to develop our own body farm type situation. Now, these are actually, it's actually a human decomposition facility. Now, it allows us to be able to set up an environment where we can mimic what we would see at different scenes in different environments under different conditions to see how the insects develop, how the body decomposes. Now, this becomes extremely important where, if you imagine a body that is inside a motor vehicle, it's being placed inside the boot of a car. Now, how does that body decompose? And what insects are going to colonize in the specific region? Now, these are some of the challenges that we do face when we're looking at actual cases, because we don't always know how long did it take for that female fly to get into the boot and lay the eggs on that body. So this is where we have to start saying, well, how do we figure that out? Because to provide an accurate time of death estimation, we need to know all of that information, and we need to know how long it's going to take for an adult fly to arrive, to be able to pick up the odors of decay, get to the car, and then get inside the boot of the car. Because yes, they will eventually, because your boot is not completely airtight, and that female fly will stick her ovipositor into any area where she can lay her eggs, and those maggots will hatch, and they will start crawling in, and they'll get into the boot of the car eventually. But it can take a long period of time. But the other thing you have to consider is the actual physical structure of the car. Inside a car can get very hot, so you can end up with a very specific microclimate inside that area. And we need to know what is that microclimate? How do the insects develop? What is the humidity going to be? What is the temperature going to be? So without these kinds of body farm type scenarios, we don't have that information, so we don't know. And for us to be able to provide an accurate time of death or time since colonization type estimate, we need that data. So it is something which we desperately need around the world. In South Africa currently, we don't yet have the means to be able to do it. We're definitely hoping in the future that we will be able to have one of the first, body farms in the Southern Hemisphere. But, that is still kind of an ongoing thing. But it requires multiple permissions, multiple ethical clearances to be given before we can even do that. And people have to donate their remains, to science to be able to allow us to use them. And this is one of the big challenges. People have to donate their bodies. So it doesn't matter whether you're a medical student or a forensic scientist. If you wanted to do research, bodies have to be donated. And we actually rely on the public to be able to donate their remains to help us to be able to do this kind of research. So, you can definitely contact people within the School of Anatomical Sciences to be able to donate your body to science, or even just for the medical purposes to allow medical students to be able to improve the healthcare that we provide. But it is something which we also desperately need, is bodies to be donated for medical research as well.
I mean, I just know of a very interesting research that was done locally. I think it was Belinda Speed, who was doing a master's, I think in the Cape Town UCT's Forensic Anthropology Department, where she actually put pig carcasses, because as you say, that's a kind of what we use in lieu of human bodies, underwater in a cage in the sea. And they actually had cameras and monitoring what crabs or fish or whatever, to kind of look at decomposition of bodies and what happens under seawater. So, there's really some phenomenal things that will be done locally that can be done. But as you say, when it comes to human bodies, it's a massive ethical issue. So definitely people out there, if you're not going to donate your organs to help someone else live, consider donating your body to science. It's a massively important thing for the development of all sciences, not just sort of forensic sciences. I know we're kind of reaching our end of the time. You want to quickly mention the new job, and then perhaps we can take some questions that have popped up in the sideline and just sort of do a hot mic.
Okay, sure. I was going to make one quick comment, which was, You mentioned the bodies in water. So one of the projects which I also dealt with, we were looking at, so when we were given the introduction, we referred to, forensic phycology. So phycology looks specifically at algae. So that research was using pigs which were placed inside a pond, and we were looking at what do you see from the algae growth on the pig carcass itself. And we were able to see that gradually, as the pig starts to decompose in that body of water, you can see that different algae start to become more active. And this is because as the body is, decomposing and it's giving off various different chemicals, this attracts different algae to actually develop at different times in a very similar way to what we see with forensic entomology, but we see different species becoming active at different times. And this allows us to be able to also understand, well, what is happening as a pig is decomposing in water, and potentially, what can we do with it? So hopefully, as the data is analyzed, we're hoping that eventually this could be another way that we could provide a time of death estimation using algae instead of just using insects, because insects are excluded because the body's in water. And it's another mechanism that can potentially be used. But I mean, there's a lot more research that needs to go into it, because we just did a little bit of a pilot study to understand it and see what was happening. So that was kind of when we started. But speaking about my progression, so I've actually recently accepted a position with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I'll be actually going overseas, where I'll be based in Israel, providing the humanitarian forensic action in that area to be able to provide assistance with various different humanitarian needs. So my role is specifically a forensic analyst, which means that I'm going to be analyzing forensic data, that is being collected by various individuals. It doesn't matter for which country or organization or where it comes from. It's going to be the fact that we are completely impartial, and we just trying to see, well, what can we do to provide the best humanitarian effort within that region based on the data that's being collected.
And I can imagine, not to get into all politics, as the Gaza situation hopefully calms down, I mean, there must be lots of also bodies that are going to be still under rubble that need to be identified, etc. So in that region, I can imagine there's just a lot of work for organizations like the International Red Cross and other sort of non-politically aligned organizations.
We've filmed a little bit with the Red Cross in this area, and they do a lot of body identification work across Africa, don't they? I mean, looking at kind of conflict zones, former conflict zones, etc. Am I right?
They definitely do. They provide a lot of assistance and provide a lot of training. So that's where my training initially started in human identification. It was because of the Red Cross that I started, learning about human identification. And every year in South Africa we do run courses. I mean, it actually happens. At this university, we run a human identification workshop on an annual basis. So we actually advertise for this, and there's a small fee, but that's literally to cover the food that you are going to be eating while you're attending the course. And we teach you all the different techniques required for human identification. You can attend practical scenarios as well. We even take you into the mortuary and we show you how do we do it on an actual case, and we show you how this evidence is collected. And this is offered on an annual basis. We're trying to eventually offer it twice a year, and this is gradually developing. So we do normally have adverts to be able to promote this whenever we do it. So I think the next one is in possibly June or July, if I'm not mistaken. But of course we can always circulate that information when it becomes available. But it is something that is offered, and one of our close collaborators from our side at Wits University is the International Committee of the Red Cross, and that's a lot of what they want to do, is provide this training for individuals to allow them to be able to provide that kind of forensic work. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, you can still provide that kind of effort.
Well, so we're losing an expert to another part of the world, which is great. I mean, it's wonderful to be taking your expertise elsewhere. Are you confident that there's enough youngsters coming through to kind of fill the gap that the likes of you would leave, locally?
I definitely think so. I mean, having worked at the university for the past 12 years, I can see the caliber of students that are coming through. And, we have a large number of students with a keen interest in forensic science. They want to do a lot more. They have a lot of very interesting ideas. And when we look at a lot of the research projects that are coming out, especially from our master's students, they're doing very new and innovative things. I mean, we've had students that have a very keen interest in trying to combine AI with forensic science as well, trying to see, well, what can we do? How can we use AI to provide identification? So when we're looking at, facial reconstruction, how can we use AI to provide, possibly a more accurate estimation? Because very often when we're looking at these facial approximations, it's an approximation. It's not exactly what the face would look like, but AI can actually provide us with a lot more information about what a person could look like or might look like based on a whole host of different variables that we provided. So this is the kind of thing which, it's very nice when we have a lot of the, younger kids coming through, because they have this interest and they're already grown up in a technological age. So they have this kind of tech awareness. And that's where I think that, we need that. We need people who have this interest and the ability to apply technology to what we're already doing.
And so I pass to add on to that, because I mean, WITS is, I think, one of the few universities in South Africa that has, in our department, the BSc honors in forensic sciences. And you can do that 1-year honors with a psychology background, a BSc background. You don't have to have a BSc to go into this particular course. And you get exposed to a whole wide range of different forensic sciences. You're active in the mortuary, you're doing some basic research. So I think courses like that are giving people the opportunity to actually study forensic stuff, besides people who are going to do specified things like forensic medicine. I don't know, I think maybe UCT also has maybe an honors course.
Yes, they do.
So, hopefully that's also helping grow this talent pool of people that can then, go back to SAPS. Because unfortunately in forensics, unless you're working at a varsity or SAPS, that's kind of, to a large degree with this kind of forensics is really where you're going to be getting your employment from.
Yeah.
What are the facilities available to, what are the facilities like in the country? How well are they kept up? Are there new facilities being, are they regularly maintained? What is the infrastructure that supports this whole effort? What does that look like? And what are some of maybe the challenges therein?
So one of the good things is that, there is a very keen understanding that we do need new facilities to be developed. So within the Forensic Pathology Service, down in Cape Town, they've already got their new Forensic Pathology Service building, which is being built. So it's one of the newest state-of-the-art mortuaries that's been built. There's one still currently being built in Gauteng as well, which will be the Johannesburg Forensic Pathology Service. Once that is up and running, it will be a world-class facility. We will have toxicology labs, we will have forensic entomology labs, we'll have a dedicated human identification lab, which will include a dental lab as well as a skeletal analysis lab. So it means that we've got a lot of things that are happening and developing within the country, because there is an awareness that we do need this, because in South Africa, with our very high crime rates, we need people who can provide these kind of investigative techniques and also provide accurate information. And that's the big thing, is that we need to make sure that what we are producing is of a very, very high standard. And that's why we need, these world-class type institutes to be able to provide this information. And we need labs which are accredited, and we need labs which have state-of-the-art equipment. So once this facility is up and running in Johannesburg, we will have that kind of a facility running, which will be fantastic.
I met you at the Braamfontein mortuary, and it's, in my mind, it's a little bit what I imagine hell to be like. I don't know. It's kind of a terrifying building, Lawrence.
It can be. I mean, so unfortunately, our current facility that we have, previously that was a maternity hospital, and it was converted into a mortuary. So it wasn't a mortuary to start off with, and this is why, it's not the perfect situation. I mean, even the labs that we have there, from our forensic entomology lab, we've procured, one incubator, and then we procured another one a couple of years later. We've just got another one last year. So we've gradually added to what we had available, which improves what we can do, and it's what we have to do. We have to work with the best fit scenario. So when you look at the images that I was showing at the very beginning, that's the cheap, efficient way that we can do it, as a bare minimum. If you don't have incubators, you don't have all the facilities, there are ways to still get data that you can use in forensic investigations. But if you want to be doing what they're doing around the rest of the world, you need the correct equipment. And that does take time, especially when you're in a very resource restrictive type environment. So coming from a university, if you're in a very new department, which is very small, so when I started in our department, we didn't have the funding. So gradually we were able to procure more and more equipment, but that's from the university side. I mean, it's not coming from the police, it's not coming from the forensic pathology service yet. The new facility, the forensic pathology service, is procuring everything because they have an understanding that there is a need for this kind of data and information and expertise. So they want to provide it. So that's why they are actually purchasing absolutely everything that's going into the new facility.
It does seem to have been taking quite a long time. I mean, I've been hearing word of the new facility for 3 years, 3-4 years now.
More.
Well, me personally, I'm not an old timer like you guys in
I
this
think
field.
it's like I can perhaps say it. Maybe Lawrence, you caution about. I think it's something like 5, 6, 7 years behind schedule that it should have been completed, or something really, really behind schedule. But like you say, and I often have to go to the mortuary where Lawrence works. I mean, I'm just traumatized from the moment I park my car because I can smell the death. It's not pleasant, and something I've never gotten used to, no matter how many times I've been to a mortuary autopsy. And that really, I mean, I don't think we understand often how that I think it does take a toll on people to work. You're doing a very unpleasant job in even the best of circumstances. If your circumstances on top of that are not fantastic because of the inadequate facilities, not purpose-built, it really makes it more difficult for the people who have to do this. So fantastic when that building's going to be built. Cape Town one, as Lawrence says, is phenomenal. But even like the Cape Town Forensic Laboratory in Plattekloof, which opened, I was still in the police, so maybe like 10 years ago. I mean, that is a phenomenally modern, by any description, a world-class facility. It is super fantastic. So you do get these things. But like Lawrence says, at universities, it still almost often feels like it's hook or by crook. It's not as if there's this concerted plan that there's going to be this funding injected for the next 5 years. This is our necessary outlook. Here's the funding. And that's what is really needed at varsities, but also, with the police to build, more modern forensic laboratories. And with the one in Pretoria, Pretoria absolutely needs a brand new modern laboratory. I mean, you've got the DNA people sitting in an old hospital in Arcadia in Pretoria. You've got the original forensic laboratory in Silverton, and bits and pieces of other. So there's definitely amazing people, but also amazing facilities, but also there's a lot of stuff that needs to be seriously upgraded, and paying people a decent salary for this kind of work, which sadly isn't the case.
Here's a question a comment from Pierre. When it comes to DNA analysis and SAPs, they are understaffed and underpaid. Will this be different for your field, or is this different for your field, Lawrence? I mean, we covered it a bit, but maybe the pay side of things, the room, which ultimately is an important factor when people are considering going into a career.
So I would agree. I mean, I think being understaffed and underpaid is definitely one of the things which, it's going to be a reality in South Africa regardless. If you're employed by the university, then your salary will be linked to your position within the university. So if you're looking at a number of our experts, they might either be academics, so they'll be paid what an academic salary would be. Some might be employed as technicians, and then they'll earn whatever the technician salary is, which will be slightly lower than that of the academics. And then, even within the police themselves, it'll actually be linked to, their position and their rank as well. And that's also going to, play a huge role in how much they're actually earning. So I would say definitely underpaid within South Africa based on the expertise and the type of work that you're providing, because very often you have individuals who have done, masters, PhDs, and even postdoctoral research, and they're working, collecting maggots from decaying human remains in very strange and sometimes, like you've mentioned, terrible circumstances. And unfortunately, they're not paid as well as what they should be. So it is unfortunately a reality. I mean, I would say that, if you're looking anywhere else in the world, they would definitely be paid a lot more, and, they would be far better supported with, the equipment and the environment and everything as well.
So not just more because you're converting dollars into rand, but more as that level of position is seen as something that's more financially rewarded, even in those contexts. Yeah.
So we've got the goods. We've got the knowledge. We've got the at an academic level, but it's really the application of it that needs help, which is, I think, kind of relevant to so many things in South Africa, isn't it, these days? Just an interesting comment here from Marius. When we did our course in entomology in Gauteng with Prof. Ian de Door from Australia, he used pigs. Funny thing, the pigs were stolen during the night by nearby residents. So, some of the, which would lead to, some of the unique realities of living in South Africa. I'd be curious just to hear what are some of the kind of weirdest things that you've encountered in your work over the years. Maybe one or two anecdotes or one or two stories that's stray into the truly bizarre or odd.
One of the first ones that comes to mind is, I remember one of the first times we went down to autopsy, and people were, they brought out one of the bodies, and gradually, while the autopsy was going on, someone said to me, I think that there's some insects that are jumping. And they came a little bit closer, and then as we came closer to the body, you just saw all these maggots that just started launching themselves off the body. Now, these are known as skipper flies, so they're often referred to as cheese skippers, and they have a habit of curling around and actually extending their bodies and flicking, and they're able to jump a considerable distance. Now, the unfortunate part is it was jumping onto people, it was getting behind their masks, it was getting onto them, and people were panicking, and some people ran out of the autopsy room. People were going home and showering, and they were so freaked out because there were maggots all over the place. And the terrible thing is, it looks almost like popcorn, popping and jumping and moving around, and it's quite a funny scenario to see. But
Okay.
Especially when you know what's going on, okay, these are skipper flies, I'm not going too close. So I had nothing land on me, but everyone else had the unfortunate circumstance of getting maggots all over them, which was a terrible, funny situation.
I mean, that kind of reminds me of once we were having a staff meeting at the forensic medicine department, which is kind of based operationally at the mortuary, and there was some snacks. And I remember, I think it was me or somebody else, as we were sitting around this table having this meeting, a fly landed on one of the table of snacks, and natural thing, you wave it off, and then and then somebody said, do you really want to eat that? Do you know where that fly has been? And it kind of like, oh yeah, okay, perhaps I shouldn't eat anything that a fly has landed on in that particular context. Yeah, so yeah, it's just a different world. It's really hard to often explain it to people, and this is, I think, why we have often this kind of bit of a dark sense of humor, because shit if you don't. It's very different.
Yeah. Are there any, have you, for the forensic sciences in media, in TV series, in movies, etc. I mean, I think the first time I would remember any mention of entomology was, like you mentioned, Silence of the Lambs. But, are there any kind of glaring misconceptions that you see from the movies? Because, from media, you expect a team to turn up, and within hours, the science is happening in their kind of glass roomed lab. But just the effect of media on your job, on your role, really, has it also brought more people into the field, or what have you?
Yeah, it's definitely provided a lot more interest in the field. But the problem is, a lot of people have this idea that things happen very quickly. So they think that everything is going to happen within a day or two. But unfortunately, it doesn't happen that way. I mean, if we're just looking at the forensic entomology and you're trying to get a time of death estimation, when you take a maggot and you stick it into an incubator and you rear it at, let's say we're looking at 15 degrees, that can still take, sometimes depending on the species, up to 2 weeks in the incubator. So that means just to look at the growth rate at one temperature is taking you 2 weeks. Now, if you have 5 incubators, it means, yes, that'll be the longest period, but you still have to then sit down and calculate it and look at all the other environmental variables that are present as well. So it's taking you a minimum of 2 weeks before you're even providing a basic estimate. But if you only have one incubator, you're repeating every single temperature, or you're repeating multiple different temperatures, but you're repeating the development in that one incubator, and that's going to take you a lot longer. It's going to take you, unfortunately, several weeks to months, and you have to then maintain a fly colony as well. So that can be quite frustrating. But the other thing is that people don't realize is that, science stinks. And literally, when we do this, science does stink, and you realize how bad it can be. Some people have walked into an interview, because we conduct interviews and we do it at our facility. They walk into the facility and they just go, I can't do this, I can't handle the smell, and they run. And that's one of the things that we do see that happens. And it doesn't matter whether this is a science student or a medical doctor sometimes. some of our medical students, they've done cadaver dissections. They walk into the autopsy and they just go, I can't do that. You know, we've had situations where we've had medical students walk in and run out. I've even had a situation where I had to catch someone who fainted during autopsy, and I had to physically carry them out of the autopsy, you know, so that way they didn't land on the floor, which unfortunately is covered in blood. So you don't want to fall onto that floor. And it has happened in our situations. You know, you have to be aware that some people cannot handle the environment, even people who are trained to work with human bodies, but, you know, they prefer living bodies, of course.
Yeah.
And so I just saw a comment come in about sniffing Vicks. I've never used Vicks because Vicks opens up your airways and it provides a terrible aroma because you now have Vicks mixed with decom.
Sickly.
So what are the tricks of the trade then, Lawrence? What are, you know, for terrible smells? What is your best antidote?
You know, I actually think that you get used to it, to be honest.
Okay.
I mean, nowadays we walk into the autopsy and everyone goes, oh, it smells terrible today. And we go, you know, it is a little bit fresh in the smell, but it's not terrible, you know, and you do definitely get used to it and you do learn to kind of break it down. You go, oh, I can tell there's a decomp. So we can arrive in the morning and say, oh, they received a decomp yesterday. You can tell it straight away. And we know straight away there's a decomposed body that's going to be autopsied on that day. And, you know, it doesn't deter us at all because we can become very used to the smell. You know, if you wanted to, you could wear a thicker mask. So, you know, we have surgical masks that we wear. You could go for a much thicker N95 respirator type mask, which will obscure the odor a lot more. It's not foolproof. You'll still get the odor through eventually. Some people wear 2 or 3 masks. I think it's a bit of a waste because you only need 1 mask. And to be honest, I mean, the risk of getting anything from a dead body, you know, just from breathing it in is minuscule. I mean, the chances of you getting anything if you're not wearing a mask is almost nothing. So I wouldn't even worry. The mask is more there just to provide, you know, safety in case there is anything. But normally you don't have to worry anymore.
I mean, the one thing I noticed filming at a mortuary is just that when when you get home, I had my backpack on. You can smell it on the bag, your clothes. You can smell it in your clothes. I mean, it's really gets into everything. I mean, it's that, you know, that kind of overwhelming odor.
Yeah.
It does, and you know, especially if you've been working in the environment. So I mentioned earlier we do maceration. So maceration is where we physically remove the tissue from a decomposed body to get to the skeletal remains.
Okay.
Now, in those circumstances, we have to remove the bodies from the fridges, and then we have to work with them for sometimes several hours to be able to remove all that tissue.
Okay.
After that, I mean, everything smells. Your hair, you know, my beard often smells. So you literally go home straight away after that. You shower and shampoo absolutely everything because you will smell otherwise. And if you don't, that smell will linger for a while. Sometimes you just drive home, and then when you get home, you smell your car and you realize I have to leave the doors open and air the car afterwards as well.
I think we could carry on talking all night, gents. I just have kind of 1 or 2 just kind of wrap up questions. First of all, what would kind of your projection be for the kind of medium term, your field in South Africa, you know, considering some of the challenges we've talked about with regards to, you know, good management, you know, the police being able to ramp up the effort to be able to kind of provide more facilities and more scientists around the country. Like, what do you predict for your field locally in the next couple of years?
So I think one of the important things is that, you know, by putting out training for individuals, you know, we have multiple students that come through our programs every year. Now, depending on where they get employed, we eventually end up with experts who have a basic understanding of forensic science in general. And this means we have more individuals who can start to say, well, yes, this is why this kind of information is needed and what information we need to collect. And the big thing that I can say about the area that we're in is that you need accurate data. So if you have people collecting data that can be utilized correctly and the quality of the data is good, we're able to then start providing things where we can say, well, you know, now we have information to help with time of death estimations or identification of individuals. And when we start getting, you know, improved outcomes from these cases, it increases interest and it increases investment as well. And from there, I can see things growing. But I think that's, the big thing why, people often speak about education, but it's not just the education, it's the awareness as well. So that's why I feel, doing things like this, having podcasts, having, videos available, running training programs, running courses and teaching more and more people, it is something that we definitely need, because all you need is the right person to hear things and say, actually, yes, I want to invest in this. This is something I want to help grow within the country. And then things can be projected and actually develop far better than what they currently are right now. I also think that, the big thing is that within the universities, as the universities are starting to see what we're doing, they're starting to realize, we have experts that are employed in academia, but we're providing a service, to the wider population, not just in the academic sphere. And I think that helps, because then they realize, well, now we're doing a public service as well. And that provides new interest from the universities as well in terms of where they can actually take courses and programs and even our expertise.
Okay. And we need a Elon Musk to say, here's R1 billion.
Yes.
Research facilities, employ people in positions. That's what we really need.
He's too busy buying up things that where people can fight with each other, isn't it?
Just being weird in general. So.
Yeah. Okay. And then my last question to you, Lawrence, is, what do you anticipate in your new role? I mean, what are you looking forward to in your new role with the International Red Cross?
I think the big thing is the challenge. It's going to be a very different situation, and the challenge of the type of work, working with different data, working with different individuals from different cultures. The big thing is whenever you go overseas and you work with people from different countries, you realize how, when you're just in one country like South Africa, you realize, yes, South Africa's got a very diverse mix of cultures. But when you get exposed to other cultures, you realize how different things can be, and you have to learn to adapt a lot to the different countries that you're in. And I think that's going to be the big thing, understanding how different people work. That's going to be the nice challenge, and that actually excites me, being able to work with different people, see how they do things, see what I can bring for them and what I can learn from them as well. I think that's what I'm the most interested in.
Well, I'm pretty sure you're going to be a massive asset to their team. And learn a lot and develop, enjoy, grow. I mean, that's very important for us in this field to feel like you're growing and learning. And who knows, maybe one day you'll come back and plow all that knowledge back into our forensics. So definitely my side, I'm very happy for you, and I wish you the best of luck.
Yeah, and I hope that people who are also viewing this episode and the shows that we'll do in the next couple of weeks talking about forensics, it's nice to, like you say, it's nice to be able to contextualize these things in South Africa, in Africa. A lot of our exposure to this is in American or European media. So hopefully people listening will take away something from these kinds of discussions, and that'll help to motivate those, decision makers to do the right things as well. I mean, that's all part of, I think, this effort with a channel like Profiler, is not only to tell interesting stories, but also to really reveal to people the realities of law enforcement and crime prevention in South Africa.
Cool.
Yeah. Gerard, any final thoughts? I mean, it's been a great chat. Thanks everyone who's joined the chat and posted your questions. We managed to get through a few of them. Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us. All the best in your new role. Once you're kind of a couple of months in, we'd love to possibly welcome you back onto the show and have a chat about your new role once you've got one or two stories to share. Certainly, we're going to have lots of hours to fill with great true crime content. So we'd love to have you back on the podcast at some point in the future.
Thank you very much. I would actually very much like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. Okay, so Gerard, that's it for tonight's episode of Profiler Africa. I was just going to ask you, Gerard, just to remind everyone what's coming up in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, so as I said, if you missed the beginning, it's a bit of a forensic focus for the next couple of weeks. Next week, we have the head of forensic pathology at Wits University, Dr. Shakira Holland, how she got into forensics. We always like to know that. And of course, answering what is forensic pathology, but a big focus on what your questions are. So if you have questions you want to send through in the meantime, or of course on the day itself, Whatever you wanted to ever ask a forensic pathologist, that'll be your opportunity. So that's next week. Then the week after that, which is the 4th of February, we'll have Dr. Hestel van Staden, also a forensic pathologist, but of course a well-known author. She's got a really amazing book that was released, I think, last year or the year before. And she's also on the TV program Autopsy, which is sort of a true crime reality story about the various South African cases. And so she'll be focusing more on her own specific career, the book, the TV series, some interesting cases. So more focused than, of course, Shakira's talk next week. So definitely tune in for those.
Tune in for those. So thanks to everyone who's subscribed to the channel while you've been watching along. Please do share the podcast. Please do hit like and subscribe. It really helps us to be able, the more subscribers we have, the more people are tuning in every week, the more this will become something sustainable, and we can just be bringing you great stories week in and week out. Special thanks to Amy, Bax, and Fred for their behind-the-scenes magic. Gerard, as always, thank you so much. Lawrence, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. We really appreciate you taking the time this Tuesday night. Guys, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. I'm Paul Llewellyn. Until next time, stay curious and keep looking over your shoulder, everybody. Thank you, guys.
Cheers, everybody.
Bye.
I am a human being and I kill human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.